Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street partners with businesses, organisations, unions and social democratic parties across the globe to develop community organising strategies and train leaders to build power from within their own communities. And in 2021, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to share their stories, inspire others, take action, give hope and organise communities for change. Find out how you can partner with Dunn Street. Hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Socially Democratic is also presented to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Are you passionate about providing access to justice? Maurice Blackburn, Australia's leading plaintiff law firm, is looking for an associate to join their employment and industrial law team on a full-time, permanent basis. You will use your legal technical knowledge and expertise to strive for fair outcomes for Maurice Blackburn's clients. The role is based in Melbourne, Victoria, and to apply, go to mauriceblackburn.com.au/careers. Be part of change and fight for fair. Apply now. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast that dives into the progressive campaigns of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And on this week's show, we're joined by an old colleague of mine from our campaigning days. He's now the member for Logan in the Queensland State Parliament. Linus Power is joining us today to talk to us about Queensland politics and how COVID is impacting the good burghers of Queensland. And we'll also talk a bit about sort of Queensland politics in general and the difference between the successes that Labor's had at a state level and probably the lack of the successes that Labor has had at a federal level and a whole bunch of other things in between. So look out for today's episode with Linus. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Stitcher. And if you like the show, let us know by leaving us a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And for all the recent updates, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn. Okay, let's get to today's episode. We're taping this one on a Thursday evening in lockdown Melbourne. And joining me on the line from sunny Queensland is a former national organiser with the Australian Labor Party and a party official with the Queensland branch of the Australian Labor Party, but crossed over to the dark side when he decided to become a politician and was elected to the southern suburbs seat of Logan in Brisbane to the Queensland Parliament. He's a fellow Tim, and it's great to have him on the show today. Linus Patrick Power, welcome to Socially Democratic.
Thank you, Stephen Donnelly. And it's a big challenge that we're facing across the country, and I think we're not immune, pun intended.
We had your federal Labor colleague Annika Wells on the show a while back. I'm thinking this is pre-COVID days, and I brought up the fact with her in that show that she and I think some of her fellow members of your campaign team presented you with a framed document or a sort of a set of norms or like a campaigners' 10 commandments aimed at you to remind you that you're now crossing over from being an organiser to a politician, and just to remind you of not to break the rules. Is that, have I described it correctly?
I think you have. It's for people who organise candidates. You know about candidates' disease, and you know. So they were really having fun of. With saying that I'd be the suffering from those really the worst of those candidate afflictions, and blaming party office, finding scapegoats, all those sorts of things. So yeah, they had a good laugh at my expense.
Going hiding during call time, that kind of stuff. Now, my two questions are: does the framed document still have some prominence hanging in your office? And two, which of those commandments do you break the most often?
I think it's in a folder somewhere. The one I break, you do get grumpy as a candidate. I mean, one of the things that is a real changeover when your name's on the ballot all of that kind of objectivity and hard decision-making process you go through when you're an organiser just is harder to do. It's harder to be objective about things when it's your name. And, and I went through the really tough election in 2012 where normally candidates don't get polling. They don't get in, but people sort of made an exception for me. And the polling said that I was going to lose. And looking at a polling with your name on it that says you're going to lose and trying to be objective about, the margin of error or what their sample size was or who did the poll. And then at the end of it, making the conclusion that, yeah, this is probably a good one. I am going to lose this election. It's very different when it's your name on the piece of research that people are saying, no, I don't want to vote for that person. And that was the case in 2012. It's a very humbling thing that we didn't reach out to people. People, when I talked to them, it wasn't enough, anywhere near enough to overcome that.
I'm sure you had PTSD from that campaign, and you've just triggered some for me as well. I had just been appointed the Assistant Secretary of the Victorian branch, and I flew up to Queensland for that campaign. I think I was up there for 2 months, and I was up in Cairns working on the Cairns, Barron River and Mulgrave campaigns. Up until that point, Stephen Donnelly had never lost an election campaign that he'd been working on.
And Queensland helped?
Oh boy, did I break that streak that September 2012. And I remember standing on a polling booth in Barron River or Cairns, I think I was, and it was absolutely stinking hot, and it was stinky hot, far north Queensland, and just the grumpiness of voters coming up to the polls and just not taking your card. And I know that, there's no science behind did someone take my how to vote card? That means we're going to win the seat or not win the seat, right? But I was under no illusions that night it was not going to be a very, very good day for the Labor Party, and it turned out it wasn't, and not for you either.
No, and that day was really tough in that people would actually come up and they'd look you in the eye and in some cases pat you on the shoulder and say, look, you seem like a really nice person. And then they'd walk past and you knew that the full sentence was, you seem like a really nice person, but I'm not voting for you. They really wanted to change. And it was a terrible experience, but it's one of those humbling things that makes you stronger, to realise that you're there to serve the Queensland people, in my case, and the people of Logan. And if you lose touch with that, they're the bosses. They're the people who make the decision about whether you get to serve them or not. And I would not recommend losing the 11th safest Queensland's seat to anyone. And, that was a really soul-destroying thing, but it did make me stronger and teach me a lot about what politics is about. And again, it's different. If I'd been the organiser for that campaign, that would have been really tough. And, I am connected emotionally to the Labor Party. But when you feel the responsibility that it was your name that lost it for the Labor Party, that's a different scale of sort of angst and pain.
The seat of Logan was actually the seat of the former leader of the Labor Party as well, Wayne Goss, who was obviously a legend within the party. What was the teachable moment for you? How did you dust yourself off and pick yourself back up again and go, all right, I'll have another crack? Like some people would go, you know what, I had a go, wasn't my time, I'm not going to bother with that anymore, I'll try something different.
Well, it's interesting you mention Wayne Goss, because Wayne Goss was still a branch member in the branch, the local branch. There's a couple of local branches, but the major local branch. And so after the election, I did the barbecue to thank people, and I sent out both emails and paper letters to branch members to say, come around to my house for a barbecue in my house in Regent's Park. And I got this call, and this guy said, "Oh, it's Wayne. Would it be okay if I came?" And I said, "Of course it'd be." And Wayne Goss actually came out to my house in Regent's Park and spoke to branch members to say that the Labor Party is bigger than any one of us, and that our time would come again if we persevered and kept focusing on the things that mattered. And I thought I wanted to run again, and I told people, and that's one of the reasons why I was doing that barbecue, to reconnect with branch members and do some healing for them. But the fact that Wayne Goss wanted to come out and be part of that, he moved away to a different part of town after retiring, but he wanted to come back and give that message to the local branch members and to encourage me. That was probably the big turnaround point for me, and it was something that I'll never forget. Just an awesome experience to have the former leader come out to your house and say, our time will come again if we stick to the things that matter to people.
And how right he was, because 3 years later, you're.
Well, I don't think he or I would have picked that, but we obviously lost Wayne to brain cancer in that interim, and he didn't get to see it, but the words very much stuck with me. And he's a very, him as well as the previous member who was very close to Wayne as well, John McKell, someone that are inspirations to me.
We are going to talk about the volatility of the Queensland electorate later on in the show. But before we do that, I wanted to sort of get a sense from you about the Queensland experience of COVID over the last couple of, since COVID started, we've had episodes where we've had guests on and talked about COVID, but we had Michael Buckland on from the McKell Institute a couple of weeks ago talking about the experience in Sydney. And obviously down here in Melbourne, it's sort of a different vibe again. And I just am interested to get a sense of what are the attitudes of Queenslanders towards the pandemic, and towards the Palaszczuk government and how they're handling it, and starting with the government's approach to handling the outbreak. Because it seems to me that the government's getting it quite right with your settings. Is that the view in the community?
I think that's the view in the community. I don't think I think in the government we have a sort of more wary and humble view of it. I think the community does. Like, we just went through a by-election again. Unfortunately, we lost a member to cancer, and we had just had the by-election in the very neighbouring seat. And it was just a really strong result there. And people thought, yeah, you're still focused on the things that matter, and which in this case, COVID's a really clear example. It's also an example where people can take government for granted, but in a pandemic, the health and police and other services of government become very vital, but also the leadership becomes very vital in government. But the football team we both support had a bad year last year and had a good couple of weeks. But there's that old adage that you're never as bad as your critics say you are, but you're never as good as your fans say you are. So when Victoria, obviously, not saying Victoria didn't make some mistakes, but when Victoria went through their really tough thing, I don't think that they were that much worse than Sydney. And I don't think the Queensland, there was some lurid stories that the Libs talked about, unions and sex and ethnicity and all sorts of silly things. But I think in the Queensland government, we didn't think Victoria was that much worse than we were. We thought there was a series of events that then got out of hand and overwhelmed their contract tracing. So I thought we were pretty humble that we needed to focus on what we needed to get right. And again, New South Wales, of course, looks terrible at the moment, but I think they did some policy things, but it can get away from you very, very quickly. And this is a very tough disease that very few countries have managed to get on top of. So, for instance, I think we had great admiration for Victoria in the end for being able to get their numbers down and get back to zero, because I don't think it's an easy task at all.
What about the attitude amongst Queenslanders? It's a huge geographical state, and we've always, people from Queensland always talk to us Southerners saying you don't really appreciate the diversity of the state in terms of people's attitudes. And I certainly got a sense of that on that 2012 campaign when it was made very, very clear to me that you are not in northern Queensland, you are in far north Queensland, and do not get that wrong. Is there a diversity in terms of whether or not folks in, say, Brisbane feel the threat of COVID compared to other parts of the state?
Yeah, I think it's very, very different depending on where you are. FNQ, Far North Queensland, Cairns and its region, it used to be so connected to the international markets and to tourism that they feel the economic impact so much more, but then know that they have some distance and know that Brisbane takes the brunt first. But we had a case where someone travelled from Brisbane to Townsville and even to one of the islands off Townsville, and that obviously brought home to them how quickly it can get to a regional community. And we've seen that in New South Wales, how quickly it can change. One of the things is you do feel less in touch with the rest of the state. You're very much hunkered down to your area. I had the worst experience you can have as an MP, where the Chief of Staff to the Health Minister rang me and said, we had these 2 people who went down to Victoria, 3 people, 2 of them infected, had a party down in Victoria during your breakout and came back up to Queensland after not being fully disclosing it to the health authorities. And one of them worked in a school that is in my area. So the Health Minister's Chief of Staff rang and said, we're going to have this breakdown. We're going to have a breakout in your area. We need to lock down the school. We're setting up a testing clinic tomorrow afternoon in the school. And so that changes our area's dynamic completely. But the challenge we have at the moment is that we seem to be lagging behind other areas in terms of vaccinations. So this morning, the Premier came out to the Logan Entertainment Centre, our big council facility, and encouraged people in outer suburbia, Logan, Ipswich, and the northern suburbs, the Moreton Regional Shire, to come out and get vaccinated, and to illustrate that there was hundreds and hundreds of people going through the Logan Vaccination Centre, and that more supply is coming online. So that's our next effort. And for some people, I think there's, and I think for all Australians, before New South Wales had the big breakout, there was a sense that it was other people's problems. And we just need to get over that complacency, because I don't think anyone in the Queensland government thinks that this is an easy task, or that somehow Queensland has the magic or a secret sauce, or we certainly don't think about, no one in Queensland's tried to claim the gold standard kind of mantle, because we know it's a really tough task. And we could have one person come in from New South Wales, have a super spreading event, a party, or they saw in New South Wales there was a wedding where there was 40 people infected at the one event. And then you can have those people spread out to have a couple more super spreading events, and it can quickly get on top of you. So I think there's a wariness and a nervousness, and a knowledge that you have to act early, you have to act firmly, even when the public doesn't necessarily have a full understanding of the possible threat of exponential growth and super spreading events.
To that point about the vaccinations, because that seems to be the next national effort. I don't know if you want to be drawn in on this one, Linus, but I was interested in some of the remarks that I'd read from your chief health officer about AstraZeneca. How much do you think that has caused confusion amongst the community as to whether or not people should, particularly young people, should take AstraZeneca? Or has the confusion more come from ATAGI and the federal authorities and health officials, who have kind of given mixed messages about who can take it and when you should take it?
Well, I think there's the message intended and the message received. So I think that the message of ATAGI and the Queensland Chief Health Officer is really clear that there are some greater risks for younger people, and that you need that recommendations of, and I think that it's as if you were the local GP making a recommendation to the 18-year-old in front of you. At a public health level, in my office, we sort of did a survey of people who are immediately around the office, and one of them has a disabled son who has weakened lung conditions, and even though he could get the vaccination, the other one had a sister who can't get vaccinated because of really compounding health issues, and her doctor was not recommended against it. And the other one's mother was recovering from a heart operation and couldn't temporarily get vaccinated, since has been. But when you look at that, there's those pockets in the population. And if a young person wants to, with full knowledge, and what's important is that we haven't hidden any of this. So when I was speaking to the anti-vax mob on the polling day and at the pre-poll at that by-election, we've been really upfront and transparent about the risks, because they are small, but they are real. But emphasize they are very, very small. But we've also been really transparent about those risks. And I think that that's good to have that honesty, but we've also got to say, we've been really honest. That's why you know about these things, but then it's still worth getting vaccinated. So there's that balance between those things. So I think the Chief Health Officer and Atagi wants to have that full transparency and honesty, because they had that feeling that if we pretended to fudge over things, there could have been a real crisis in confidence that people weren't telling us the whole story. So there's swings and roundabouts on how you do that public health, public messaging. But, definitely I would encourage, I've obviously got my mum she's got AstraZeneca, my brother's got AstraZeneca. I was in the age group to get Pfizer, but I encourage every single person in Logan and in Australia to get vaccinated, and get vaccinated before there's any further encouragement.
I think your dog has opinions on that as well. Maybe you can.
My dog just did have opinions. Yeah, sorry.
How has the media covered the pandemic up in Queensland and the response to it? Is the approach similar to that of what we're seeing from New South Wales, the Daily Telegraph's approach, which could be best described as sort of this Sydney strong, we're all in this together? Or are they adopting more of a Victorian-style Herald Sun version, which is, how can we best undermine the Victorian government's health message at every single opportunity?
Well, I don't, spend money on the paywall on the Herald Sun, so I haven't read the articles in detail. But we did see the headlines, and we did see the attacks. We did also see how Sky, and for that matter, how the Telegraph and the Courier Mail treated the Victorian government. But yeah, the Courier Mail and the News Corp papers up the coast have absolutely taken the Victorian Sun approach, which was to carp, to undermine, to create uncertainty, to second guess. And we had at one point, of course, the LNP arguing to have the border open with New South Wales and to have all borders open. And the Courier Mail was the main cheerleader for that. And there was a story just yesterday where they were effectively arguing for the border to be open with New South Wales by highlighting the genuine difficulties that are on the border region. But instead of putting all of their influence towards creating a health zone that actually would protect people in northern New South Wales by putting the border on the Tweed or the Clarence River or some natural area, they could have put pressure on the New South Wales government to do that. Instead, they're effectively attacking the Queensland government over that. And yeah, they've very much taken the Herald Sun attitude. The thing is that we've really, I think, been doing those calls to people in our electorates and speaking to people in our electorates. So the Premier this morning, the number of people, I mean, admittedly, this is people who are getting vaccinated. So they're self-selecting group. The number of people who stopped her and said, thank you for what you're doing. Don't stop, keep strong, was amazing. And, I had a small business breakfast where the guy who runs it is one of the local pastors, fantastic guy. And he asked them to go around the room and to say one thing we're thankful for. So I think I said, I'm thankful for my kids that, and almost everyone else said, I'm thankful to be in Queensland where we've been kept safe and strong and we've, haven't had COVID. So sometimes I think you can have the noise of the Skies and the Courier Mail and, the Herald Sun. But when you listen to people on a genuine level, they're not yelling it and screaming it, and they don't have a newspaper to back them, but they have very strong, defined opinions. And that's whom you've got to actually get in contact with. And yeah, they very much have been backing the Queensland government. They also know that we're not perfect, and we know that there's a lot of uncertainty. But they've actually, I think, been really supportive of us being careful and cautious. And also, Queenslanders very much have an idea that if a Sydney person says, you're all a bunch of hicks up there, you don't understand it, you should do what we're doing. Well, we know the answer is not to do that, So, Sydney people telling us what to do is not necessarily going to influence us that much.
How much does, with your campaign hat on, how much does newspapers like the Courier Mail come into play with your communication strategy? I feel like the Victorian experience under the Andrews Labor government since 2000, well, even before 2014, but since they formed government, is that the Herald Sun, and it sounds weird to say this, when I think about when I grew up and I joined the Labor Party as a young bloke, the Herald Sun, they were one of the pillars of Victorian established society, and they made and break governments. And I think the Andrews government now, I don't think they give a shit about the Herald Sun, and I think that they know that. Daniel Andrews' Facebook page has got more likes than the Herald Sun. The Herald Sun wrote a double-page spread a couple of weekends ago that talked up the strength and the reach and the successful strategy of Daniel's social media campaign. It was basically almost an admission that we are losing and we are no longer relevant, but we're going to complain about it. And I don't know if they realised the irony of the article when they wrote it, and they dedicated two and a half pages to it, as if it was some sort of sinister, sort of dark hand of, operation of, it's just government doing what governments do. So from a campaign strategy standpoint, I know that in the 2018 campaign, we didn't give a shit about the Herald Sun, Like they're not going to, we're never going to get anything good from them. So let's keep on doing what we do. Stick to the process. What about up in Queensland? Are you guys worried about the Courier Mail, or is it, you've been pretty successful over the last however many years of, being in government.
Well, I think it's complex because if the Courier Mail has sort of, I think, campaigned, I don't think they would, or maybe they would think that, I'm not sure, but against Labor very, very strongly. And if people read the Courier Mail and believed it in an absolute sense, then no one in Greater Brisbane would vote for us. But I don't think they completely have. I do think they have. People do read it and they do take it in, and it does become part of a conversation. And I do think that you need to continue to respect and reach out, but you're reaching through some of the editorial decisions. And I think that, you can't get buffeted by really, really negative stuff, but instead need to try and have your voice where people can see through the negativity, perhaps where you're going. So that's the way I think about it is, but if you allowed yourself to completely get knocked off course, or to chase some of the really, quite virulent stuff that they do, then that would be debilitating for you. So in that way, you can't let it dominate your agenda. You need to speak, through to people who are still reading it, it still has influence, but obviously it's not, considering how strongly they've, gone against us, and the people in Greater Brisbane especially aren't responding to that. It is a different world. It's certainly different from when, the 80s, the Courier Mail was something that, was the institution in our household and, part of the furniture. It doesn't feel like that anymore. It certainly doesn't feel like that in Logan households. If I, spoke to 15-year-old kids about when was the last time they read the Courier Mail, I don't think it would be there. I used to read it at Hungry Jack's and McDonald's as a sort of habit to go and get our coffee, and they've stopped actually stocking it. Which when that begins to fall away, you think, it's really not got the institutional reach that it once had. And especially in the outer suburbs, I think it just doesn't speak to people in the outer suburbs nearly as much.
I want to talk to you about Queensland the electorate and the volatility of it. I was doing a bit of research today and comparing sort of past election results at a state level in Victoria and in Queensland. And in a minute, I also want to ask sort of some of the experiences you've had in your own seat of Logan, which I think is quite interesting too. But starting with at a broad level, if you look at the election results in Victoria that go back, say, from 2010 through to the 2018 state election, there was a 3.5% swing to the Liberals on primary in Victoria in 2010, which gave them government, and that picked up 13 seats. 4 years later, there was a 1.8% swing to Labor on primary, which gave them 4 seats, which got the Andrews government in. And I think it actually just underlines how close that election actually was. I think a lot of people think that Daniel was always going to win it, but no, it was a knife fight. 4 years later, we have this landslide to Labor for Victorian standards, which was a 4.5% swing on Labor's primary, and then we picked up 8 seats. Now, let's go north to Queensland, shall we?
Yeah. I mean, those weren't small swings on Victorian standards, were they?
Oh, that was huge.
When we come to Queensland.
Unbelievable. 2012, 8.1% swing to the LNP on their primary, and that gave them 44 seats. 3 years later, just under 3 years later, 10.8% swing to Labor on your primary, which you picked up 37 seats. What is going on there? Why is that the case?
Well, one of the things is that the structure of Queensland, you've got these coastal towns where you have in the coastal town, you create effectively a marginal seat, because you've got people who are working either on the ports or the sugar mills or in transport and trucking or retail. And then you've got the people who own the farms and the land. They both live in the same town. So you create a kind of different marginal dynamic there. Most of those seats are relatively marginal and can swing. We tend to hold the town ones, and but we've lost them on occasions. And the National Party tends to hold the sort of donut around the town. But we've won them on occasions. So that's that dynamic on the coasts. And in Brisbane is that Sydney has a real east-west divide. Melbourne has a kind of east-west divide, and then the Frankstons and there's a bit of a different, and Dandenongs are a bit different. But there is a bit of an east-west divide. Whereas Brisbane, you can have really quite wealthy suburbs right next to relatively poor suburbs. So the Karawatha Forest divides one of the poorest areas of Woodridge from multi-million-dollar houses just across the other side in Stretton. And even a couple of streets away in Stretton, it's much more modest housing. And that pattern gets reproduced in Brisbane quite a lot. So even in things like South Brisbane or West End, you have students and the traditional working people who are Greek or Italians, and then much more wealthy people moving in. And it tends to create much more marginal seats that have the ability to be won or lost. So that's part of the kind of structural thing about Queensland. The other thing is, I think that Queenslanders do have the ability to change and to swing much more. And the interesting thing is how different they can be at a state and federal level. The polling booth that I handed out on Boronia Heights, the federal election, for Bill Shorten's election, there was a 22% primary difference on that polling booth between the federal results and my results as a state MP. And I'm not that good. There is a real difference where people can make judgments and change their voting. They're not stuck on things and permanently attached to parties. So there's both those factors in play, but partly, and you got to remember that at one point we had 67 out of 89 seats in Labor, And then 10 years later, it was complete reversal the other way. So, yeah, it's partly demographic, partly about the fact that Queenslanders can change between those two. There's also the upsetting factor of One Nation that kind of acts as a kind of sort of breaking off of some votes from traditional allegiances. So all of those are in play.
Look at your own seat of Logan in 2017. You had the strongest One Nation vote of any Labor seat, with the LNP being reduced to just 18% on a primary vote, and One Nation was well over 30%. And then 2020 Queensland state election, we saw the One Nation primary vote fall to 13%. How did you and your campaign effectively engage with those One Nation voters to bring them back into? I'm assuming they came back to Labor because you had a swing to you. So,
well, a good percentage of them did, and there was a strong candidate that they had in 2017 who's actually now a councillor in the local area, thankfully not with any One Nation affiliation. And you always try and work openly and honestly with people about the issues that matter. So I'm glad that he's no longer affiliated with One Nation. But he was a tough campaign candidate to campaign against. The Liberal Party didn't put up much of a fight there, but you can see how much that change was, as how dynamic it can be. And I think you've just really got to not make judgments about the person because of the way they had cast their vote at one particular election. And you got to look at yourself. I think losing so badly in 2012 for the Labor Party and for myself personally, you had to think, what can I do to engage with people? The other one is never to write off votes, never to write off an area, never to write off the people involved. And I think of the person who's voting One Nation is that they often feel insecure about something that's going on, whether that's their work or the society. And I personally think that we have a good society, and we need to show and demonstrate that we're trying to focus on the right things and the values that matter to them, and to continue to do that. And you just do that drip, drip, drip and persevere with it. And what was tough at that election was a redistribution meant that I had a really big change in the electorate. So I didn't know a lot of those people. And I didn't have the chance to actually do that one-on-one conversations and to be at the market stalls and to see people at their schools and to do all those things. So it allowed that kind of cynicism about politics, and cynicism about where people were taking the state and that's really what One Nation does. On the flip side, I think in the inner city is not immune from this, because the Greens model is very much it's an anti-politics model. It's trying to breed cynicism about what we're doing in government. They're often about different policy ends, but really the policy ends are actually just about an opportunity to be cynical about government and what it's achieving in Australia. And our job is to say, we are doing some decent things. Here they are, and we're decent people focused on decent values. And whether that's the Greens in the inner city or One Nation or even on the recent by-election, sitting next to anti-vaxxers, they weren't wearing masks, which I found very disturbing. But engaging with them and saying, well, I can see why you're concerned about that, but this is why we did it. Just even telling them that no one in state government wants a lockdown. It's the last thing we want. And we're doing it because we think it's the way to reduce the impact on people as much as possible. Even that, and there might be disagreements that obviously didn't necessarily agree with that, but just even saying that we were trying to do it for the right reasons makes a difference to voters. When you politely say to them what you're trying to focus on.
This is a broad question here, but what do you think are the strengths of the Palaszczuk government? What's the central message that you would take to the next election that voters can get around? I'd say, yeah, that pitch to me makes sense, and therefore I would support another 4 years of Labor. Well,
partly it's about that during a time of crisis, we focused on the things that mattered to people: keeping people safe, keeping the economy running, generating jobs, and we also are a government that does listening. I think the Premier really leads from the front on that, in that she doesn't have a style that says that, although, I mean, she's very strong, but she doesn't have a style that says, oh, I'm doing this because I'm smarter and better than you. She has much more of a style that says, I'm listening and working through this and taking on advice. But once, and especially during COVID, but once we've got the advice, this is where we're going, and we all need to do it together. So partly it's the leadership style, but partly it's because you've got to focus on things that matter to people. Like, I know in Victoria, where the railway projects, the getting rid of the crossings, became iconic to show that the Andrews government really understood suburban voters who were held up at those points. And there was a kind of iconic thing to say, we get some of your biggest frustrations and we can do something about it. That's not sophisticated or dramatic, but I think it was pretty effective. And I think if you firstly do those things, but secondly find those issues and talk about them genuinely, I think that's always effective. I think there's also a lot of water to still go with this pandemic and where we go. So we need to keep that focus on and keep making good decisions and keeping Queenslanders safe, keeping generating jobs.
Can you get your thoughts on the comparison, the success that Labor has had at a state level in Queensland compared to that at a federal level? At a federal level, Labor's performance in Queensland has nothing been short of appalling.
It's appalling.
2019 federal election, we won 6 out of the 29 seats on offer. 2016, we won 8. 2013, we won 6. 2010, we won 8. 2007, that was the Rudd election, we won 15. That was our best result. But 2004, under Latham, my God, can we take a moment to realise that man was a member of the Labor Party at once and the leader, and we won 6 seats. So historically, it's a pretty poor track record. But it's not as if Queenslanders don't know how to put a 1 next to the word Labor on a ballot paper, because over that same 17-year period, the Queensland State Labor team have been out of government for only like 2 years and 10 months. What is federal Labor getting so wrong so consistently, do you think?
Partially, there's part of it is that the at times the Queensland Liberal and National Party separately and the LNP together could, be very unprofessional and allow people to think, are these guys really ready for government? And then when they were in government, they were horrific Kennett-style wreckers who bulldozed through people, again in a Kennett style. So people kind of they actually can distinguish that organisation is quite different. Now, there is a some extent that maybe people think or see the Labor Party as more, not Queensland at a federal level. But then again, I think that they, to some extent, admire the professionalism of the Victorian and Sydney Liberals. So there's a lot of contradictions involved in it that I'm not great at explaining. And even, as I said, I handed out on the same booth with a 22% difference between state and federal elections. And the scare tactics about the taxes were just so much more effective in this hardworking community of Boronia Heights than they had any right to be. But they're very good at sowing seeds of doubt about people whom may seem distant and more Sydney and Melbourne. And I think that that's more difficult for the Liberal National Party to do when it is the Queenslanders that are right in front of them, with the Queensland Labor Party. Nobody can say that Peter Beattie or Anastasia Palaszczuk aren't, people feel like they're people you can reach out and touch. They know what suburb they live in. They know what they do. So it's much harder to run those scare campaigns. Whereas I think they could paint various Labor leaders as much more distant and non-Queensland kind of values. The other thing is the mining and resources. You've got to feel that people are connected and understand the jobs that drive Queensland. Now, not that many people on the south side of Brisbane perhaps work in coal mining, but they do have a strong feeling that you've got to get Queensland. You've got to be part of a place that is a bit different. And that's something that I think federal Labor needs to work at and be conscious of. WA, of course, is the same thing. They perhaps feel, their chip on the shoulder even more, that they're more distant from the centre of power and centre of things, and they want someone who really gets them. And it doesn't have to be a Queenslander. Like Kevin Rudd obviously was very effective at that. But it has to be someone who really engages with this place and really gets them.
On that point then, because it felt like that Scott Morrison did get Queensland, and he knew that. His remarks on election night, how good is Queensland, drove that home, which probably would have just pissed you off completely, because it certainly burned my piss.
Wasn't a good night.
No, terrible night. But now I'm thinking, from election night in 2019 to midway through this pandemic, I kind of thought that Morrison was untouchable. But I really have started to feel like there's a lot of cracks that can be, some creases that can be turned into cracks, that can be turned into gaping holes, that can unpick his leadership whenever we do go to the polls. What's your feeling of Queenslanders' attitudes to Scott Morrison, his leadership and his government at the moment?
A complex question, because I think Queenslanders wanted to get behind and be supportive. And I've gone through this cycle myself through COVID. When we formed the National Cabinet and, we called for the border with China and the border with other countries to be shut, and they went with that. And then we called for what became JobKeeper. We wanted a wage support package that kept people attached to federal Labor and Queensland. And through the National Cabinet, they did that. I had this enormous feeling of we were all working together. And for me, the journey's been really hard because I really wanted to support him at that point. Like, I might seem naive but then in Queensland especially, we saw that he would say one thing and then send out Dutton or one of the others to then go and attack what we were doing to try and keep Queenslanders safe. And it's turned out to be the policies that now are really being adopted nationwide. And there was a real feeling that there was a sneering contempt of the hillbillies from the north and their border closures and their insular ways. And I really thought that there was sort of double dealing on that. So that's my own journey, where I really had naively wanted to believe in Morrison and had that really cruelly dashed. I think for a lot of Queenslanders, they would have gone on a similar journey. But because they probably were bigger supporters to begin with, would have felt that even stronger. But I don't know, for some, you definitely feel that they've crashed in the same way I have and feel quite let down by him. For others, I think they still want to hang on to the fact that, that they hope he's trying to do the right thing through COVID. So it is beginning to have that tarnish come off. And, for us, I think there needs to be the simple message is that, have they got anything right? Of all the key big decisions, they either had to be dragged kicking and streaming to them, or they got them absolutely wrong. And the big case in point is that we wanted to do a really big quarantine centre based on a regional airport. And Morrison directly and especially had undermined that completely. And all we wanted to do was, if you could divert international flights to the airport outside Toowoomba, then we would do all the rest. And they've refused to do that, partly because of domestic internal LNP issues, I think. But it's come at an enormous cost. I mean, if we'd had a bigger centre up and operating, and that particular passenger that came into Sydney that caused all of this issue had been flown into the purpose-built quarantine centre at Wellcamp, that would have eliminated all of those problems. And the economic cost of that is so enormous. And it's really about, I think, they began to try and see political angles. And I try and be charitable to, New South Wales or even Victoria, when they had their issues, is that it's not an easy thing to do when they were trying to do their best efforts. And mistakes were made and issues became very difficult. I didn't necessarily agree with New South Wales policy, but I could see what they were trying to do in minimising lockdowns as much as possible. However, we weren't trying to sort of cadge political angles. And I feel like Morrison did that to Queensland and to Queenslanders. And it worked for a while. But I think he's really been found out. And, the gold standard, I know we all snigger at that, but I think it was New South Wales trying to do their best. But you can't be complacent about this. You've got to really get focused on the fact that this is an enormously wicked and difficult disease to get control of. And as soon as you get complacent about it, that's the worst thing.
Look, that's our hour, and we could keep talking about this forever, but I am going to take this opportunity because it's my podcast and I can do what I like. I just want to quickly talk to you about Celtic because that's what I want to do. And I left it at the end. I never do this to my listeners and put it up at the front. Them having to skip through and get to the bit they're actually here to listen to. So everyone else, you can go. My cousin Sean in Riyadh, he'll stick for this for the last part of the episode. Obviously, the club was going through a historic...
first, before you go there,
yeah.
It seems like we were the only two Celtic supporters who don't have a podcast about Celtic.
Oh.
Because it seems like there's enough of them, doesn't there?
There are thousands of them now. My brother and I had one years and years and years and years ago, and we sort of, it's just too hard to keep up. Anyway, but yeah, missed out on an opportunity there. Obviously, tried to go for 10 in a row last year, didn't get it. We all went horribly wrong. Sacked our manager midway through the season. Rangers go on to win their very first Scottish Premier League championship. Congratulations to them. Took us 6 months to find a replacement. Now we've got what appears to be our second or third choice for a manager. But in the end, I think we're all quite happy with it because it's Ange Postecoglou, former Brisbane Roar, former Melbourne Victory manager, former Socceroo manager. We got knocked out of the Champions League qualifiers. But since then, we've won 5 games straight, scored 18 goals, playing attacking, attractive football. It's even getting me up at 4:30 in the morning to watch European qualifiers for the first time in quite some time. Did you expect the team's performance to turn around so quickly under Ange's tenure?
The short answer, you have to say no. I thought we were going to go through at least 6 months of difficulties. I guess one of the things is the underlying quality of players, Forrest and a lot of really good players that hadn't gone away, even though they felt like they'd completely disappeared in the last 6 months of last year. That a new broom and a new sort of identity and a new way of could bring those people together. But then, you look at Furuhashi and that obviously just blows minds. And it just seems to be creating people. It's almost like we did a body swap. Like they look the same, but we sort of changed the internals of people because people look completely different. The articles about Ralston.
Who knew? Who knew he was a footballer? Tom Rodgick, welcome back. Great to see you again. Loving this.
Yeah. I think Rodgick had injuries that were probably more profound than people let on, but he was also a kind of malaise and a disinterest in him. And, but yeah, he's got some sweet touches. And him and Furuhashi together is something really quite, I don't know if we're being one-eyed, but it does seem pretty beautiful football. Like there's something quite special about it.
It's the football the style of football that I've come to expect Celtic to play, growing up listening to my dad and talking about Celtic in the 50s and the 60s, you know, it's cavalier, it's charge, it's just absolutely going out. I don't know if we can keep it up for 90 minutes, but it's just such attractive football to watch. And you know what? In some ways, I feel super proud that as an Australian Celtic supporter, seeing Ange at the helm of a club that, you know, we've followed since we're kids and wanted to play for him to be doing this and doing it well. I know it's early days. I'm not going to get too carried away. But I've already booked my tickets for the Europa League final in Seville. I'm so excited by it all. I feel rejuvenated.
Yeah, I mean, watching Furuhashi with the outside of his boot, outside of his right boot, do that curving pass across to Forrest, and then Forrest to cross it back into the centre. It's just, you know, like, you know, I could spend months attempting to play that first pass. Like, you know, I can pass with the outside of my right boot, but at that pace with that curve, and then you just saw the backs just look at each other. The defenders just look at each other and go, "What was that? And where did it come from?" Yeah. So I mean, I don't. And the other thing is, a season's a long season, and injuries and frustrations, and but it just seems like there's if last year there was talent and a set of situations meant everyone was playing 10 or 20% less, and that meant that the sum was less than the whole, and the whole thing wasn't working. Now, with everyone stepping up that extra 10% above probably their best play, the sum of the parts is really combining together really well. But then again, I just was looking at the golf reporter from the BBC, and he'd done who's a Hearts supporter, and he'd done some article saying we were a debacle, and the story was 3 weeks old. So
was that Ewan Murray?
Yeah, that's him.
Yeah, he's a wanker.
But it's amazing though that you kind of think it has only been 3.5 weeks or 4 weeks or something. So we just need to keep our feet on the ground. But gee, it does feel special. And it's amazing how you can connect your well-being into a football club, you know.
I was thinking about that this morning. I was watching the game going, man, I've got to stop letting this team dictate the happiness of my life or the depths of misery, because it's ridiculous. It's a football team, but
I allowed COVID to define my misery last year, so I just tried to ignore it. So I sort of sidestepped it a little bit and dealt with the painful realities in front of us. But this year I sort of dared to dream, and it just does feel pretty special, doesn't it? Like some of the play.
Yeah, it does. I'm looking forward to when we play them at the end of this month. So maybe we do our own podcast and catch up and talk about it. We can do a spin-off.
We can do the 10,001st Celtic podcast.
Socially Celtic or something. I don't know. Anyway, we can work it out. Linus Power, it was wonderful to have you on the show today. I've been meaning to get you on the show for quite some time, so I do appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to come and talk to us today.
I appreciate it, Stephen. Go the boys.
Here. How.
Thanks, mate.
Hey there. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And to get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.